The 13th nanny lasted exactly 4 hours and 27 minutes. Robert Bobby Mitchell stood frozen in the emergency room doorway, his coffee cup trembling against his lips as he watched the psychiatric team restrain his 5-year-old twins. The boys weren't just having another meltdown, they were screaming for someone who didn't exist. Tommy threw himself against the hospital bed rails while Timmy clawed at the air, both crying out desperately, "Where's Mama Grace? We want Mama Grace!" The head nurse stumbled backward, her clipboard clattering to the sterile floor as she stared at Bobby in confusion. Bobby's heart hammered against his ribs as he remembered tucking these same boys into bed just 2 years ago, when Sarah was still alive and their laughter filled the Germantown mansion. Now they were broken, unreachable, calling for a woman no one had ever heard of. "Sedate them," the doctor commanded, his voice cutting through Bobby's paralysis. Who was Grace? And why did his sons believe she could save them when 13 trained professionals had failed? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Bobby Mitchell had owned the world. His logistics empire stretched across 3 states, moving everything from medical supplies to military equipment with the precision of a Swiss watch. The Germantown mansion sat on 4 acres of manicured Tennessee hills, its white columns gleaming like promises of the American dream. But money couldn't buy back his wife, Sarah, couldn't heal the trauma that had shattered his boys, and couldn't explain why 13 different childcare professionals had fled his home in tears. The twins had been normal once. Tommy, the older by 3 minutes, had been the talker, chattering about dinosaurs and dump trucks until Sarah's accident. Timmy, quieter but observant, had followed his brother's lead in everything. Now they lived in a world of silence broken only by violent outbursts and whispered conversations with invisible friends. The house that once echoed with laughter had become a mausoleum of broken toys and unused bedrooms. Eleanor Mitchell, Bobby's mother, ruled the mansion like a faded Southern belle clinging to old money and older prejudices. At 68, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who believed bloodlines mattered more than character. "The Mitchell name means something in this town," she'd remind anyone who'd listen, her silver hair pinned in the same style she'd worn since 1975. But even Eleanor's iron will couldn't discipline the chaos the twins had brought to their carefully ordered world. Across town in Orange Mound, Grace Washington counted her last $23, while the foreclosure notice taunted her from the kitchen table. The shotgun house that had sheltered 3 generations of Washington women would be gone by Christmas. At 38, Grace possessed the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from fighting battles she couldn't win, against poverty, against a healthcare system that priced compassion, against the memory of small hands that had grown cold in hers. She had been one of St. Jude's best pediatric nurses for 12 years, the one they called when frightened children needed gentle hands and a voice that could sing away nightmares. But loving other people's children had become impossible after Joshua. The 8-year-old boy with the crooked smile and brave heart had needed a simple surgery. Routine, the doctor said. Routine if you had insurance. Routine if you weren't working 3 jobs to pay rent. Routine if the system saw your child as worth saving. Now Grace cleaned office buildings at night and searched want ads by day, her nursing license gathering dust while medical bills gathered interest. The $847,000 debt from Joshua's final weeks followed her like a shadow, turning every phone ring into potential disaster. She'd answered the Mitchell Mansion job posting, not because she wanted to work with children again. That wound was too fresh, too raw, but because desperate people couldn't afford to be picky. Neither Bobby nor Grace knew that their paths had crossed before, in sterile hospital corridors where life and death decisions were made by accountants instead of doctors. Neither knew that Eleanor Mitchell had been watching, waiting, carrying secrets that would either heal 3 broken hearts or destroy what little remained of their fractured worlds. The morning Grace Washington arrived at the Mitchell mansion, she carried nothing but a worn leather purse and the kind of quiet dignity that comes from surviving the unsurvivable. The job posting had been vague. Household assistant needed, experience with children preferred, but Grace needed work more than she needed specifics. As she walked up the circular drive, past fountains that probably cost more than her yearly salary, she wondered if this was another mistake in a year full of them. Eleanor Mitchell answered the door wearing pearls at 9 in the morning and the expression of someone who'd smelled something unpleasant. "You must be here about the housekeeping position," she said, not bothering to hide the emphasis on housekeeping. Her eyes swept over Grace's second-hand dress and scuffed shoes with the practiced dismissal of someone who'd spent decades categorizing people by their usefulness. "Yes, ma'am." "Grace Washington." Grace extended her hand, unsurprised when Eleanor didn't take it. Through the marble foyer, she could hear something that made her blood run cold, the sound of a child in distress, the kind of keening wail that meant more than ordinary hurt. "Well, I declare," Eleanor muttered, dabbing her forehead with a lace handkerchief. "The help can't even handle them anymore. Bobby's upstairs trying to—" Her words were cut off by a crash that shook the crystal chandelier, followed by a man's voice raised in frustration. Grace didn't ask permission. Something deeper than professional courtesy pulled her up the grand staircase, past oil portraits of stern-faced Mitchell ancestors who seemed to judge her with painted eyes. The sound grew louder, not one child crying, but two, their voices harmonizing in a way that spoke of shared trauma. She found them in what must have been a playroom, though it looked more like a war zone. Tommy sat in the corner, rocking back and forth while banging his head against the wall in a rhythm that would leave bruises. Timmy stood in the center of the room, screaming at a volume that shouldn't have been possible from such small lungs, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. Bobby Mitchell knelt between them, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face showing the particular exhaustion that comes from loving someone you can't help. "Boys, please," he was saying, his voice cracking. "Daddy doesn't know what you need. Tell me what you need." Neither child acknowledged him. They were locked in their own private hell, unreachable as distant planets. Grace had seen this before, in the pediatric ward when children had been pushed past their breaking point. Without thinking, she began to hum, low and soft, an old spiritual her grandmother had sung during Mississippi cotton-picking seasons. "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." The effect was instantaneous and impossible. Tommy stopped rocking, his head turning toward Grace with the sharp attention of a bird hearing its name. Timmy's screaming cut off mid-breath, his wild eyes finding Grace's face and staying there as if she were an anchor in a storm. For a moment, the room held its breath. Bobby froze in place, afraid any movement would shatter whatever spell Grace had cast. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face gone pale as Sunday communion bread. Then Timmy spoke, his voice barely a whisper but clear as church bells. "Joshua's mama." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. Joshua. They couldn't know that name. Joshua had been hers alone. Her secret son who wasn't really her son. The boy whose death had broken something inside her that couldn't be fixed. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her throat where she still wore the small gold cross he'd given her. "How do you know that name?" she whispered. Tommy had risen from his corner and was walking toward her with the slow, careful steps of someone approaching a wild animal. His eyes, Bobby's eyes, she realized, were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to run. "You sang to Joshua when he was scared," Tommy said, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone children used for truths adults couldn't handle. "He told us you would come. He said you smell like heaven and sadness." Eleanor gripped the doorframe so hard her knuckles went white. Bobby stared at his sons as if seeing them for the first time. These children who hadn't spoken a coherent sentence in months, suddenly carrying on a conversation about a dead boy their father had never heard of. "Who is Joshua?" Bobby asked, but Grace was already backing toward the door, shaking her head. "I can't do this," she said. "I'm sorry, I can't." But Tommy caught her hand, his small fingers surprisingly strong. "Please don't leave us like everybody else does. We've been waiting so long for Joshua's mama to come home." Grace stayed. Not because she wanted to, but because something in Tommy's grip reminded her of another small hand that had once held hers with the same desperate faith. Bobby cleared his throat, running his fingers through hair that probably cost more to cut than Grace made in a week, and asked the question that hung in the room like smoke from a house fire. "Would you consider staying? Just temporarily, until we can figure out what's happening here?" Eleanor's sharp intake of breath could have cut glass. "Robert Mitchell, have you lost your ever-loving mind? We don't know anything about this woman. She could be anybody, a criminal, a drug addict, Lord knows what kind of people. The kind of people who can calm my sons when nobody else can," Bobby interrupted, his voice carrying the edge of a man who'd reached the end of his rope and found it frayed beyond repair. "Look at them, Mother. When's the last time you saw them this peaceful?" Indeed, both twins had settled into an eerie calm, sitting cross-legged on the carpet like small disciples waiting for a sermon. Timmy had found a coloring book and was actually coloring within the lines for the first time in months. Tommy was stacking blocks with the focused concentration of a surgeon, building something that looked almost like a tower instead of his usual chaotic destruction. Grace watched them with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years reading the subtle language of troubled children. Their body language spoke of relief so profound it was almost heartbreaking, the way their shoulders had dropped, the way their breathing had steadied, the way they kept glancing at her as if to confirm she was still there. These boys had been drowning, and somehow, inexplicably, she had become their life preserver. "I don't understand what's happening here," she said quietly. "I don't know how they know about Joshua, and I don't know why they think I'm his mama. But I can tell you one thing for certain, these children are carrying trauma that goes deeper than losing their mother." Bobby's face went through a series of expressions like pages flipping in a book. Surprise, confusion, something that might have been hope, and finally a weariness that seemed to age him 10 years. "What do you mean?" Grace knelt beside Tommy, who immediately leaned into her warmth like a plant seeking sunlight. "Children don't develop selective mutism and violent episodes from grief alone. Something specific happened to them, something that made them retreat into themselves. They're not just sad, they're terrified." "Terrified of what?" Eleanor demanded, but her voice had lost its earlier hauteur. Now she sounded like what she was, a grandmother watching her grandson suffer. "I don't know yet," Grace admitted. "But Joshua—" She paused, the name still difficult to say aloud. "Joshua was a little boy I cared for at St. Jude Children's Hospital. He died 8 months ago from complications during heart surgery. There's no way your boys could have known him, but somehow they do." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a butter knife. Eleanor's face had gone white as church linen, and she was gripping the doorframe again with those thin, aristocratic fingers. Bobby was staring at Grace like she'd started speaking in tongues. 8 months ago, Bobby repeated slowly. "That's when the boys started having problems. Right after Sarah's funeral, they just changed. The doctors said it was normal grief response, that children process loss differently." "Mr. Mitchell," Grace said gently, "with respect to your doctors, this isn't normal grief. This is trauma response. These boys saw something or experienced something that their minds couldn't process. And somehow that something is connected to Joshua. Timmy looked up from his coloring book, his small face serious as a judge. Joshua wasn't scared when he went to heaven because you sang to him. He said the angels sound just like you. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She had sung to Joshua during his final hours, old spirituals her grandmother had taught her, songs about going home and finding peace. But these boys couldn't have been there. She would have remembered. She remembered every face in that pediatric ICU, every family member who held vigil, every tear that was shed. "Timmy, honey," she said carefully, "where did you see Joshua?" "At the sad place with the white walls and the beeping sounds," Timmy replied matter-of-factly. "Mama was sleeping in the white bed and we had to be very quiet. Joshua was in the room next door and he was crying because nobody came to see him except you." Bobby's knees buckled slightly. He reached for the wall to steady himself, his face going gray. "You were at the hospital during Sarah's treatment?" The pieces were starting to fall into place like dominoes in Grace's mind. But the picture they formed was impossible. Sarah Mitchell. The name had been on the ward roster, in the room adjacent to pediatric oncology, where Grace had spent those final weeks with Joshua. A young mother, wife of a wealthy businessman, fighting a losing battle against cancer while her twin boys waited in the hallway because children weren't allowed in the adult ICU after visiting hours. "Sweet Jesus," Grace whispered. "You're Sarah Mitchell's boys." Eleanor made a sound like air being let out of a balloon. She slumped against the door frame, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Robert, I think we need to sit down, all of us." But Bobby was already moving, crossing the room to kneel beside Grace and his sons. "You knew my wife. You were there when Sarah was dying?" "I was caring for Joshua in the pediatric ward," Grace said softly. "But yes, I saw you. I saw your boys waiting in the corridor during visiting hours. They were so quiet, so well-behaved. I remember thinking how brave they were, how they understood something terrible was happening, but they couldn't do anything about it." Tommy abandoned his blocks and crawled into Bobby's lap, something he hadn't done since his mother's death. "Daddy, Joshua said his mama would take care of us when our mama went to heaven with Jesus." The next 3 weeks passed like scenes from a movie Grace wasn't sure she wanted to be in. She'd agreed to a trial period, 30 days, to see if whatever magic had calmed the Mitchell twins could be sustained, or if it was just a fluke born of desperation and coincidence. Bobby had offered her more money than she'd made in 6 months of night shift cleaning, enough to keep the foreclosure vultures at bay a little longer. But money wasn't what kept her coming back each morning to the mansion in Germantown. It was the way Tommy would run to the window at 8:30 sharp, watching for her old Honda Civic to wheeze up the drive. It was the way Timmy had started sleeping through the night for the first time since his mother's death, no longer waking the household with screams about monsters in the hospital walls. Eleanor watched Grace's integration into their daily routine with the suspicious attention of a hawk circling prey. "I still don't understand why they respond to her," she'd mutter to Bobby over morning coffee, her voice pitched just loud enough for Grace to hear from the kitchen. "It's not natural, the way they've taken to her. Children need structure, discipline, not all this singing and storytelling nonsense." But even Eleanor couldn't argue with results. The twins were speaking in complete sentences now, asking questions about their day, expressing preferences about food instead of simply refusing to eat. Tommy had started drawing again, not the violent scribbles that had covered his bedroom walls after Sarah's death, but actual pictures of houses and trees and stick figures holding hands. Timmy had discovered a love for cooking, standing on a step stool beside Grace in the kitchen while she taught him to measure flour and crack eggs without breaking the yolks. Grace found herself falling into rhythms she'd thought were lost forever. reading bedtime stories with different voices for each character, the way she used to do for Joshua during his long hospital nights, teaching simple songs that helped the boys remember to brush their teeth and pick up their toys. Most surprisingly, she found herself laughing again, real laughter, not the polite sounds she'd been making for the past 8 months whenever someone tried to cheer her up. Bobby watched these transformations with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment that left him feeling off balance in his own home. He'd built his fortune on understanding systems, on identifying problems and implementing solutions. But Grace's effect on his sons defied every logical framework he possessed. She had no degrees in child psychology, no training in behavioral modification, no certificates hanging on any wall. What she had was something he was beginning to recognize as a gift, the ability to see straight into the heart of what a child needed and give it without question. "How do you know what to do with them?" he asked her one afternoon, finding her in the backyard teaching the twins to plant sunflower seeds in the patch of earth Eleanor had always kept strictly ornamental. Grace wiped dirt from Timmy's nose before answering. "I don't always know, but I listen to what they're not saying as much as what they are. Children tell you everything you need to know if you pay attention to the whole conversation." The whole conversation. Their body language, their silences, the games they invent, the way they arrange their toys. She gestured to where Tommy was carefully spacing each seed exactly 2 inches apart, measuring with his fingers. "Tommy needs control right now. His world got turned upside down when his mama died, so he's trying to create order wherever he can. That's why he counts his steps between rooms and arranges his crayons by color every night before bed." Bobby looked at his son with new eyes, seeing patterns he'd missed in his own grief-soaked fog. "And Timmy? Timmy's the emotional one. He feels everything twice as deep as most people, which means he hurts twice as much but also loves twice as hard. He's the one who'll remember every kindness and every cruelty for the rest of his life." Grace's voice softened as she watched Timmy gently pat soil over his seeds. "He reminds me of Joshua in that way. Both of them born with hearts too big for this hard world." The mention of Joshua still made Bobby's chest tighten with questions he didn't know how to ask. Grace had shared the basic facts, that Joshua had been a child in her care at St. Jude, that he'd died during surgery complications, that somehow his death had coincided with the beginning of his son's behavioral crisis. But there were pieces missing from that story, gaps that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Eleanor emerged from the house carrying a pitcher of lemonade and wearing the expression she usually reserved for necessary evils like tax season and charity functions. "Grace, I need to speak with you privately," she announced in the tone that had intimidated Memphis society matrons for 4 decades. Grace rose from her knees, brushing dirt from her hands. "Boys, keep planting. I'll be right back." She followed Eleanor to the shaded terrace where wrought iron furniture sat arranged like a courtroom. "Sit down, child." Eleanor poured 2 glasses of lemonade with the precision of a pharmacist measuring medicine. "I've been doing some thinking about this situation, and I believe we need to establish some ground rules if you're going to continue working here." Grace accepted the glass but didn't drink. Eleanor's lemonade was always too sweet, as if she believed sugar could mask whatever bitterness she was about to serve alongside it. "What kind of ground rules, Mrs. Mitchell?" "First, I want it understood that you are an employee, not family. I've seen how attached the boys are becoming, and I won't have them confused about your role in this household." Eleanor's voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Second, there will be no more of this Joshua business. I don't know what game you're playing with my grandson's minds, but it stops now." Grace set down her glass with careful control. "Mrs. Mitchell, I haven't been playing any games. Your grandsons brought up Joshua's name, not me. If anything, I've been trying to avoid that subject because it's too painful to discuss." Then explain to me how two 5-year-old boys know intimate details about a child they've never met. Children don't just conjure names and faces from thin air. Eleanor leaned forward, her pale eyes sharp as winter ice. Unless someone has been filling their heads with stories. I've told them exactly one story about Joshua, Grace replied steadily. That he was a brave little boy who went to heaven and that I loved him very much. The rest of what they know, Mrs. Mitchell, I can't explain it any more than you can. Eleanor studied Grace's face with the intensity of a jeweler examining a potentially valuable stone for flaws. What she saw there must have surprised her because her expression shifted from suspicion to something that might have been concern. There's something else, Eleanor said quietly. I've had some inquiries made about your background, financial inquiries. Grace's stomach dropped like a stone thrown into deep water. She'd known this moment would come. Rich people didn't hire strangers to care for their children without investigating every detail of their lives. The question was how much Eleanor had learned and whether she'd use that information as a weapon. I see, Grace said, proud that her voice remained steady. Your debt situation is quite severe. Nearly $1 million in medical bills from that boy's treatment. Eleanor's tone had lost its edge, becoming almost conversational. That's the kind of burden that could drive a person to desperate measures. Grace met Eleanor's gaze directly. Are you asking if I took this job to steal from you? Because if that's your concern, you can search my things, monitor my activities, do whatever you need to feel secure, but I won't be dismissed because I'm poor. I'm not dismissing you, child. I'm trying to understand you. Eleanor sipped her lemonade, seemingly unaware that she'd just dropped a conversational bomb. It occurs to me that someone with your financial pressures might be motivated by more than just the salary we're paying you. Meaning what, exactly? Eleanor set down her glass and folded her hands in her lap with the deliberate care of someone choosing her words like weapons. Meaning that wealthy widowers with traumatized children have been targeted before by women looking to improve their circumstances. It wouldn't be the first time someone used a caregiver position to work their way into a family's good graces and financial holdings. The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from a brush fire. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from anger so pure it made her vision shimmer. She stood slowly, placing her palms flat on the glass-topped table. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen carefully. I am not after your son's money. I am not scheming to become the next Mrs. Mitchell. I am a woman who lost everything trying to save a child I loved, and I am working hard to rebuild what's left of my life. Your grandsons need care, and I can provide it. That's the extent of my interest in this family. Eleanor didn't flinch under Grace's direct stare. If anything, she seemed to approve of the fire she'd sparked. Good. I'm glad we understand each other. Because there's one more thing you need to know about the Mitchell family, and it concerns that boy you keep mentioning. Grace felt the world tilt slightly, as if she were standing on the deck of a ship in rough seas. What about Joshua? 8 months ago, I made an anonymous donation to St. Jude Children's Hospital. $50,000, designated specifically for pediatric cardiac surgery funding. Eleanor's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. The donation was made on behalf of a little boy named Joshua. It arrived exactly 1 day too late. The lemonade glass slipped from Grace's fingers and shattered on the terrace stones, sending shards glittering across Eleanor's perfectly maintained patio like fallen stars. Grace stared at the broken glass scattered across the terrace stones, each shard catching the afternoon light like fragments of her shattered understanding. The world had tilted on its axis, and she was struggling to find her footing in a reality that no longer made sense. Eleanor Mitchell, The woman who had spent weeks looking at her like something distasteful tracked in on the bottom of a shoe had tried to save Joshua. "You donated the money," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "You tried to save him." Eleanor's composure cracked like ice on a pond in spring. Her carefully maintained mask of Southern propriety slipped, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. "I tried," she said, and her voice carried the weight of 8 months of sleepless nights. "God help me, I tried, but I was too late." "How did you even know about him?" Grace asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. The pieces were starting to form a picture she wasn't sure she was ready to see. Eleanor stood and walked to the edge of the terrace, her back straight as a church pew as she gazed out over the manicured lawn where Tommy and Timmy were still planting their sunflower seeds with the focused intensity of small prophets. "I knew about Joshua because I make it my business to know things that affect my family. When Sarah was undergoing treatment at St. Jude, I had someone monitor the situation, not just her medical condition, but everything happening on that ward." Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You had me investigated 8 months ago?" "Not you specifically. The entire pediatric staff. I wanted to know who was caring for my daughter-in-law, what kind of people had access to her when my son and grandsons weren't there to protect her." Eleanor's hands gripped the terrace railing so tightly her knuckles went white. "But my investigator kept mentioning this one nurse who worked nights in pediatric oncology, Grace Washington, who sang spirituals to the children and stayed past her shifts to comfort families who couldn't afford private rooms." The memory hit Grace like a physical blow. Long nights in the pediatric ward, sitting beside beds of children whose parents had to choose between staying with their sick babies and working the jobs that kept food on the table. She'd made it her mission to ensure no child faced their darkest hours alone, even if it meant sleeping in hospital chairs and living on vending machine coffee. "Your investigator told you about Joshua," Grace said. It wasn't a question. "He told me about a little boy with no family except a nurse who'd taken guardianship when his teenage mother abandoned him in the emergency room. He told me about a child who needed heart surgery that insurance wouldn't cover, and a woman who was liquidating her entire life to pay for it." Eleanor's voice grew stronger, as if confessing was giving her back some measure of control. "He told me about medical bills that would bankrupt most people, and a nurse who kept working double shifts while her own world fell apart." Grace sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why let me suffer thinking no one cared, that Joshua died because the world was too cruel to save one small boy?" "Because I was a coward," Eleanor said simply. "Because admitting I tried to help a black child meant admitting I wasn't the woman I'd spent 68 years pretending to be. Because my donation failed, and failure isn't something we Mitchell women are supposed to acknowledge." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the terrace, and in those shadows, Grace saw the outline of a different story than the one she'd been telling herself. Eleanor Mitchell wasn't the heartless aristocrat she'd appeared to be. She was a woman carrying her own burden of guilt and regret, her own sleepless nights wondering if she could have done more, acted faster, saved a child whose only crime was being born into circumstances beyond his control. "The boys," Grace said suddenly. "Tommy and Timmy. They were at the hospital during Sarah's treatment. They must have seen Joshua, heard me singing to him." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Children see things adults miss. They process information differently, remember details we think they're too young to understand. While we were focused on Sarah's condition, they were absorbing everything, the sounds, the smells, the conversations they overheard when they thought no one was paying attention. That's why they knew about the singing, why they called me Joshua's mama." Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. She'd cried enough tears over the past 8 months to fill the Mississippi River. They witnessed his final hours from the hallway, didn't they? My grandsons have been carrying trauma from more than just their mother's death, Eleanor confirmed. They watched a little boy die alone, except for a nurse who loved him enough to bankrupt herself trying to save him. They saw what real sacrifice looks like, what unconditional love means, and they've been waiting for that same love to find them. Grace looked out at the twins, who had finished their planting and were now building what appeared to be a fairy house out of twigs and leaves. Tommy was arranging small stones in a perfect circle while Timmy gathered flower petals to scatter inside it. They worked with the intense concentration of children creating something sacred, something that mattered in ways adults couldn't fathom. "Mrs. Mitchell," Grace said carefully, "there's something I need to know. When your investigator was watching the pediatric ward, did he see something else? Something that explains why you really hired me?" Eleanor returned to her chair, moving like a woman 20 years older than her actual age. "What do you mean?" "I mean that out of all the household staff applications you must have received, you chose mine. A woman with no references, no experience in domestic work, and nearly $1 million in debt. That's not a hiring decision based on qualifications. That's a decision based on something else entirely." Eleanor was quiet for so long that Grace wondered if she'd pushed too far, asked for truths that were too dangerous to speak aloud. When the older woman finally responded, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You're right. Of course. I didn't hire you to clean my house or even to care for my grandsons, although God knows they needed someone who understood their pain." Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph, creased and worn as if it had been handled many times. "I hired you because of this." Grace took the photograph with trembling hands. It showed the pediatric ward at St. Jude, taken from the hallway through a partially open door. In the foreground, 2 small boys sat on plastic chairs, their faces pressed against the glass of an observation window. In the background, barely visible through the glass, a woman in scrubs knelt beside a hospital bed, her arms wrapped around a small figure while she sang. "He took this the night before Joshua's surgery," Eleanor said. "The night before my donation arrived too late to save him. My investigator said you stayed with that child for 18 hours straight, that you held him while he was scared and sang to him when the pain medication wasn't enough and promised him that dying wouldn't hurt because you'd be right there with him." Grace's vision blurred as she stared at the photograph. She remembered that night, the longest night of her life, watching a child she loved more than her own breath slip away, despite everything she'd tried to do to save him. She remembered promising Joshua that heaven would be beautiful, that his grandmother who'd passed when he was 3 would be waiting for him, that love was the one thing that followed you beyond the grave. "My grandsons saw you love someone else's child with the kind of fierce, protective love their own mother had shown them," Eleanor continued. "They saw you fight for a little boy who had nothing, and they've been waiting ever since for someone to fight that hard for them." Grace set the photograph down with careful reverence, as if it were a holy relic. "And you've been carrying the guilt of not acting fast enough to save him." "Every single day for 8 months, Eleanor admitted, wondering if I'd made the donation a week earlier, a day earlier, even a few hours earlier. Would it have been enough? Would that precious child still be alive? Would my grandsons have been spared the trauma of watching him die?" The 2 women sat in silence, bound together by shared grief and the weight of what-ifs that could never be answered. The afternoon light was fading, painting the terrace in shades of gold and amber that made everything look soft around the edges, forgiving. "Mrs. Mitchell," Grace said finally, "Joshua's death wasn't your fault any more than it was mine. We both tried to save him in our own ways, and we both arrived at the fight too late to change the outcome. But maybe, Just maybe, we can still honor his memory by saving these two little boys who loved him enough to wait for his mama to come take care of them." Eleanor nodded, tears finally spilling over cheeks that hadn't allowed such vulnerability in decades. "Lord willing, child, Lord willing." The crisis came on a Thursday morning in late October, when the Memphis air still held summer's dying breath, but the leaves had begun their slow surrender to autumn. Grace arrived at the mansion to find Bobby's Jaguar missing from the circular drive and Eleanor pacing the front porch like a caged panther, her usual composure shattered beyond repair. "Thank God you're here," Eleanor breathed, rushing down the steps with an urgency that sent alarm bells ringing in Grace's head. "It's the boys. They're gone." Grace's blood turned to ice water in her veins. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "I put them down for their afternoon rest, same as always. When I went to check on them an hour later, the beds were empty. Windows still locked, doors still closed, but they're nowhere in the house." Eleanor's hands shook as she twisted her pearl necklace, a nervous habit Grace had never seen before. "I've searched every room, every closet, every hiding place they've ever used. They've vanished like smoke." Grace was already moving toward the house, her mind racing through possibilities. The twins had been doing better, sleeping through the night, eating regular meals, even laughing at Bobby's terrible jokes during dinner. But children who'd survived trauma carried invisible wounds that could split open without warning, especially when triggered by something adults couldn't anticipate. "Where's Bobby?" Grace asked, taking the stairs two at a time. "Emergency board meeting in Little Rock. His phone keeps going straight to voicemail." Eleanor followed close behind, her expensive heels clicking against the marble like a countdown timer. "Grace, they took something with them. Something that makes me think this isn't just children playing hide and seek." Grace paused at the top of the staircase, dread settling in her stomach like a stone. "What did they take?" Eleanor led her to the twins' bedroom where everything appeared normal except for one glaring absence. The wooden box that usually sat on Tommy's nightstand, the one where he kept his most precious possessions, was missing. Grace had helped him organize that box just last week. His mother's wedding ring that Bobby had given him to hold, a hospital bracelet from his birth, a small stuffed elephant named Peanut that had been his constant companion since infancy. "They've run away," Grace said with the certainty of someone who'd worked with traumatized children long enough to recognize the signs. Something spooked them badly enough to make them think they needed to leave. "But what? Everything's been going so well. They've been happy, settled. I thought we were past all this." Eleanor's voice cracked on the last words, revealing the grandmother's heart that beat beneath the steel magnolia exterior. Grace knelt beside Tommy's bed, running her fingers along the quilted comforter their mother had made before her death. Children's reasoning followed different logic than adult thinking, but there was always a catalyst, always something that triggered flight response in small minds already programmed for survival. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to think carefully. Has anything changed in the past few days? Any conversations they might have overheard? Any visitors to the house? Anything that might have made them feel unsafe?" Eleanor's face went pale as old parchment. "Oh, sweet Jesus! The phone calls." "What phone calls?" "This morning before you arrived. My sister Margaret called from Atlanta, said she'd heard rumors about Bobby and you, about how it looks, a wealthy widower with a black woman caring for his children. She said people are talking, that it's not appropriate, that the boys need proper influences." Eleanor's words tumbled over each other like water rushing through a broken dam. "I told her to mind her own business, but the boys were playing right here in the hallway. They must have heard every word." Grace closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of other people's prejudices settling on her shoulders like a winter coat she'd never asked to wear. She'd known this day would come, the day when the outside world's opinions would crash through the protective bubble they'd built around the twins' healing process. Children absorbed adult conversations like sponges, and Tommy and Timmy had already learned that the grown-ups in their lives could disappear without warning. "They think someone's going to take me away from them," Grace said quietly. "Just like their mother was taken away. Just like Joshua was taken away. But where would they go? They're 5 years old." "They don't have anywhere." Eleanor stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening with sudden understanding. "The hospital. They'd go back to St. Jude." Grace was already grabbing her car keys. "Call Bobby. Tell him to meet us there. And Mrs. Mitchell, call the police. Tell them we have 2 missing children who are trying to walk from Germantown to downtown Memphis. They could be hit by a car, picked up by strangers. Anything could happen." The drive to St. Jude Children's Hospital took 15 minutes in normal traffic, but Grace made it in 10, running red lights and praying to every saint she'd ever learned about in Sunday school. Eleanor called out directions from the passenger seat while simultaneously trying to reach Bobby on his cell phone, her voice growing more frantic with each attempt. They found the twins in the hospital's memorial garden, a quiet courtyard filled with bronze plaques honoring children who'd lost their battles with cancer and other diseases. Tommy and Timmy sat beneath an oak tree whose leaves were just beginning to turn gold, their small arms wrapped around each other in a protective huddle. Tommy's precious box sat open between them, its contents scattered on the grass like offerings at an altar. Grace approached them slowly, the way she'd approach any wounded creature that might bolt at sudden movement. "Tommy? Timmy? What are you boys doing here, sweethearts?" Tommy looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for his 5-year-old face. "We came to tell Joshua goodbye. We wanted him to know we have to go away now." "Go away? Honey, what makes you think you have to go away?" Timmy clutched his stuffed elephant tighter, his voice barely above a whisper. "The lady on the phone said you don't belong with us. She said people like you and people like us can't be a real family. She said somebody would make you leave just like they made Joshua's first mama leave him." Grace knelt on the damp grass beside the twins, her heart breaking into pieces small enough to fit through the eye of a needle. She'd spent months helping these boys learn to trust again, teaching them that love was stronger than loss, that family was about choice rather than blood. And in one careless phone conversation, all of that progress had been shattered by the poison of someone else's prejudice. "Boys, look at me," she said gently, waiting until both sets of eyes focused on her face. "Do you remember what I told you about love? How it's like sunlight. It doesn't matter what color flower it shines on. It makes everything grow." Tommy nodded slowly, but his expression remained troubled. "But what if they make you go away, like they made Joshua go away? What if we love you and then you disappear?" Grace reached out and gathered both boys into her arms, holding them against her chest where they could hear her heart beat, solid and steady and permanent. "Listen to me very carefully. Nobody is going to make me go away. Nobody can make me stop loving you. I made a promise to Joshua before he went to heaven, and I made a promise to your mama before she went to heaven, and now I'm making a promise to you." "What kind of promise?" Timmy asked, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I promised I would take care of the children who needed me most. I promised I would love you with all my heart for as long as God gives me breath in my body. And Grace Washington does not break her promises." Eleanor stood at the edge of the garden, tears streaming down her face as she watched the woman she'd once viewed with suspicion gather her grandsons into the kind of fierce, protective embrace that spoke of love deeper than bloodlines. This was what real family looked like, not the cold perfection of social expectations, but the messy, complicated, beautiful truth of hearts that chose each other despite what the world might say. "Boys," Eleanor called softly, stepping into their small circle. "There's something else you need to know. Something about your daddy and me and Grace, and why nobody, not Aunt Margaret or anybody else, is going to take her away from us." Tommy and Timmy looked up at their grandmother with eyes still bright with unshed tears, waiting for whatever truth she was about to share. And Grace, still holding them close, felt the first stirrings of hope that maybe, just maybe, love really was strong enough to win this battle. Eleanor knelt in the damp grass beside Grace and the twins, her silk stockings be damned, and pulled a manila envelope from her purse with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. The envelope was thick, official-looking, the kind that contained documents that changed lives forever. She'd been carrying it for 3 days, waiting for the right moment to reveal its contents, never imagining that moment would come in a hospital garden where a dead child's memory had drawn her grandsons like pilgrims to a shrine. "This envelope contains papers that make Grace a legal part of our family," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of decisions that had taken her 68 years to make. "Guardianship papers giving her the same rights as your daddy when it comes to your care and protection. Nobody can take her away from us because she belongs to us now, legally and officially." Bobby's voice cut through the afternoon air before either twin could respond. "What the hell is going on here?" He was striding across the memorial garden like a man approaching a house fire, his expensive suit wrinkled from travel and his face showing the particular panic that comes from receiving multiple frantic voicemails about missing children. "I got 6 messages from Mother, 4 from the Memphis Police Department, and I just spent the last 2 hours thinking my boys were dead in a ditch somewhere." Grace started to rise from where she knelt with the twins, but Tommy's grip on her arm tightened. "Don't leave us," he whispered. "Please don't leave us alone with the angry voices." Bobby stopped short, his anger deflating like a punctured balloon as he took in the scene before him. His mother kneeling in the dirt, her perfectly coiffed hair disheveled and her makeup streaked with tears. Grace holding his sons with the fierce protectiveness of a lioness guarding cubs. Tommy and Timmy clinging to the 2 women like they were lifelines in a stormy sea. The wooden box of treasures scattered across the grass like the remnants of a broken dream. "Boys," he said, moderating his voice to the gentle tone he'd been practicing since Grace had taught him that children responded to calm strength rather than raised voices. "You scared us something fierce. Why did you run away?" Timmy buried his face deeper into Grace's shoulder, but Tommy straightened with the solemn dignity of a child forced to grow up too fast. "The mean lady on the phone said Grace would have to go away because she's different from us. She said people would be mad if we loved her like our mama." Bobby's jaw clenched so tight, Grace could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "What mean lady? What phone call?" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "Margaret called this morning. She said things about Grace and you and the boys that were unkind." The children overheard. "I see." Bobby's words came out clipped and controlled, but Grace could see the fury building behind his eyes like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. She'd seen that expression before, on the faces of parents in the pediatric ward when they realized the insurance company was more interested in profit margins than their children's lives. It was the look of someone preparing for war. "Mr. Mitchell," Grace said carefully, "the boys were trying to come tell Joshua goodbye. They thought if they had to leave, they should explain to him first." Bobby looked around the memorial garden as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the bronze plaques and marble benches dedicated to children who'd fought battles too big for such small warriors. His gaze settled on a particular plaque near the base of the oak tree where his sons had taken shelter, and Grace watched his face change as he read the inscription, "Joshua Michael Washington, age 8, beloved son and light of the world, gone too soon but never forgotten." "Sweet Jesus," Bobby breathed. He's buried here." "Not buried," Grace corrected softly. "His ashes are scattered in the garden. He loved flowers, especially sunflowers, because he said they were tall enough to whisper secrets to the clouds." Tommy wriggled free from Grace's embrace and walked over to his father, tugging on his suit jacket until Bobby knelt down to his level. "Daddy, Joshua told us in dreams that his mama would take care of us. But we got scared when the phone lady said she wasn't allowed to stay. We thought maybe we should come live here with Joshua instead." Bobby gathered his son into his arms, holding him tight enough to convince them both that letting go wasn't an option. "Tommy, listen to me very carefully. Nobody, not Aunt Margaret, not anybody, gets to decide who our family is except us. Grace isn't going anywhere because we're not going to let her." "But what if people are mean to us?" Timmy asked from his position in Grace's arms. "What if they say ugly things about us loving Grace?" Eleanor struggled to her feet, brushing grass stains from her skirt with movements that spoke of newfound resolve. "Then they'll have to answer to me. And trust me, boys, your grandmother has been dealing with small-minded people for longer than you've been alive. I know exactly how to handle them." Bobby stood as well, shifting Tommy to his hip with the practiced ease of single fatherhood. "Mother, about those papers you mentioned." Eleanor handed him the manila envelope with ceremony befitting the passing of a crown. "Legal guardianship documents. I had them drawn up 3 days ago by Harrison Whitfield. You remember Harrison? He handles all the old Memphis family's affairs. Everything's already been filed with the court. Grace Washington is now legally recognized as co-guardian of Thomas and Timothy Mitchell, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails." Grace felt the world tilt on its axis for the second time in one afternoon. "Mrs. Mitchell, you can't just— I didn't agree to this. Legal guardianship is a serious responsibility." "Child, you've been acting as their guardian for months. The papers just make it official." Eleanor's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be argued out of it. "Besides, there's more in that envelope than just guardianship documents." Bobby was scanning the legal papers with the intensity of someone reading his own will. "Mother, this says Grace is also listed as beneficiary of a trust fund for the boys' education and care." A rather substantial trust fund. $2 million, Eleanor said calmly, enough to ensure the boys' needs are met regardless of what happens to the rest of us. The trust specifies that Grace has full discretion over how the funds are used for their benefit. Grace felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. "I can't accept this. It's too much. You're just what?" Eleanor interrupted, her voice sharpening. "Just the woman who brought my grandsons back from the edge of complete breakdown? Just the woman who taught them to laugh again, to trust again, to believe that love could exist without loss? Grace Washington, you saved these children when the rest of us had given up hope. The least this family can do is give you the legal protection and financial security to continue that work." Tommy had been listening to the adults with the intense concentration children reserve for conversations that would determine their fate. Now he spoke up with the clarity that sometimes came from minds too young to complicate simple truths. "Grace, are you our mama now? Like really and truly our mama forever?" Grace looked into his eyes, Bobby's eyes, Sarah's determination, but something uniquely his own shining through, and felt something shift inside her chest. The wall she'd built around her heart after Joshua's death, the barrier that had protected her from loving too much again, cracked open like an egg revealing new life. "If you want me to be," she said, her voice thick with tears she'd been holding back for months, "if you'll have me as your mama, then yes, really and truly forever." Timmy launched himself out of her arms only to throw himself back into them, followed quickly by Tommy, who'd wriggled down from his father's embrace. Both boys clung to her like they were afraid she might evaporate if they loosened their grip. "We want you forever and ever and ever," Timmy declared with the intensity of a child making a sacred vow. Even when we're grown-ups with our own kids," Tommy added solemnly. Grace looked up at Bobby through her tears, suddenly uncertain. Legal guardianship was one thing, but what they were discussing went deeper than paperwork and court orders. They were talking about becoming a real family, about choosing each other despite what the world might think or say. Bobby knelt beside them in the grass, adding his arms to the circle of embraces. "Grace, I know this is sudden. I know it's complicated, but my boys are right. We want you forever. All of us, if you'll have us." Eleanor watched the four of them kneeling in the memorial garden, surrounded by the names of children who'd fought their final battles in this hospital, and felt something that had been frozen in her chest for decades finally begin to thaw. This was what love looked like when it transcended the artificial boundaries society tried to impose. This was what family meant when it chose heart over convention, hope over fear. "Well," she said, brushing a final tear from her cheek, "I suppose we should go home and start planning a proper celebration. After all, it's not every day the Mitchell family gains a new member." As they gathered Tommy's scattered treasures and prepared to leave the memorial garden, Grace took one last look at Joshua's plaque. In her mind, she could almost hear his voice, the way he'd sounded during those final hospital nights when morphine made him philosophical beyond his years. "Mama Grace, love is the only thing that follows you to heaven. Everything else you leave behind for someone else to find." She'd found her someone else. Two someones, actually, plus a father who was learning to see beyond color to character, and a grandmother who was discovering that love could be stronger than a lifetime of prejudice. Joshua's love had followed her from heaven back to earth, leading her to the family she'd never known she needed. "Thank you, baby," she whispered to the memorial plaque. "Thank you for showing me the way home." 1 year later, Grace Washington Mitchell stood in the kitchen of their new home, not the imposing Germantown mansion with its marble floors and intimidating grandeur, but a warm colonial in midtown Memphis where the neighbors waved from their porches and children rode bicycles in streets lined with oak trees that had witnessed decades of families growing and changing and learning to love beyond the boundaries society tried to impose. The morning light streaming through gingham curtains illuminated a scene that would have been impossible to imagine just 18 months earlier. Tommy and Timmy sitting at the breakfast table, their school uniforms pressed and their lunch boxes packed, arguing good-naturedly about whether dinosaurs or astronauts were cooler while Grace hummed spirituals and flipped pancakes shaped like sunflowers. Bobby sat at the head of the table reading the morning paper, occasionally interjecting commentary about their debate that made both boys dissolve into giggles. Eleanor had moved into the guest cottage behind the main house, claiming she needed to downsize after decades of rattling around in rooms too big for one person. But Grace suspected the truth was simpler. Eleanor Mitchell, at 69, had discovered that being a hands-on grandmother was far more satisfying than being a distant matriarch. She appeared now in the kitchen doorway, her silver hair still impeccably styled, but her pearls replaced by an apron that proclaimed "World's Best Grandmother" in crayon-bright letters. "Morning, family," Eleanor said, the word family rolling off her tongue with the ease of someone who'd finally learned its true meaning. "Grace, I've got the garden club meeting at 10, but I'll be back in time to pick up the boys from school." "Garden club meeting or garden club intervention?" Bobby asked with a grin, not looking up from his newspaper. "I heard Margaret's been spreading her particular brand of Christian charity again." Eleanor's smile turned sharp as a Sunday sermon. "Let's just say I've become quite evangelical about the virtues of minding one's own business and the sin of judging others. Margaret and her cronies are getting a full education in what the good book actually says about love and acceptance." Grace set a plate of sunflower pancakes in front of each twin, watching as their faces lit up with the simple joy that still caught her off guard after months of being their legal guardian. The guardianship papers had been finalized 6 months ago, but the emotional adoption had happened that day in the memorial garden when three broken hearts had chosen to heal together. "Mama Grace," Timmy said around a mouthful of pancake, "are you nervous about today?" "Today?" Grace's stomach fluttered like butterfly wings against her ribs. Today was the opening of the Joshua Michael Washington Children's Memorial Fund, a foundation Bobby had established in partnership with St. Jude's Hospital to provide financial assistance for families facing catastrophic medical bills. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that Joshua's death, which had once seemed meaningless and cruel, was now saving other children whose only crime was being born into families that loved them but couldn't afford the price tag American healthcare placed on their lives. "A little nervous," Grace admitted, settling into her chair between the twins, "but mostly excited. Today feels like a new beginning for all of us." Tommy, who had inherited his father's analytical mind along with his mother's stubborn streak, looked up from his systematic deconstruction of his pancake. "Mama Grace, will there be reporters there, like on TV?" "A few," Bobby answered when Grace hesitated. "Channel 5 is coming, and the commercial appeal is sending someone. But remember what we talked about. You boys don't have to talk to anyone you don't want to talk to. This is your day as much as anyone's." The boys had insisted on being part of the foundation launch, despite the well-meaning adults who'd suggested they were too young to understand the implications. But Tommy and Timmy had surprised everyone with their articulate explanations of why helping sick children mattered, their matter-of-fact acceptance of questions about their unusual family structure, and their fierce defense of the woman they now called Mama Grace without qualification or apology. Eleanor poured herself coffee from the pot Grace always kept warm, settling into the chair that had become hers by right of love rather than law. "Speaking of reporters, I do hope that nice young man from the Tri-State Defender will be there. His article last month about mixed families in Memphis was beautifully written." Grace smiled, remembering the article that had featured their family alongside 6 others who'd chosen love over convention. The headline had read, "Beyond Color, Memphis Families Redefining What It Means to Belong," and the accompanying photograph showed the 4 of them in their backyard, Tommy on Bobby's shoulders, while Timmy helped Grace tend to the sunflower garden they'd planted in Joshua's memory. The response to the article had been overwhelmingly positive, with letters pouring in from families across the South sharing their own stories of love transcending racial boundaries. But there had been negative reactions too. Ugly phone calls that Bobby handled with the quiet authority of someone who'd found his moral center, anonymous letters that Eleanor dealt with using methods she described as creative disposal, and the occasional pointed comment at the grocery store that the twins had learned to deflect with the resilience of children who knew they were loved unconditionally. "Are you ready for this?" Bobby asked Grace quietly while the boys finished their breakfast and Eleanor regaled them with stories about her garden club conquests. Grace considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Was she ready to have her face in newspapers, her story told on television, her private grief transformed into public inspiration? Was she ready to represent something larger than herself? To become a symbol for other women who loved children that didn't share their DNA? "I'm ready to honor Joshua's memory," she said finally. "I'm ready to help other families avoid the financial nightmare we went through. And I'm ready to show the world that love doesn't see color. It just sees hearts that need healing." Bobby reached across the table and took her hand, his wedding ring. They'd married in a simple ceremony at Claiborne Temple, the historic church where Dr. King had once preached, catching the morning light. "Then we're ready." The foundation launch was scheduled for 2 o'clock at St. Jude's Hospital, in the same memorial garden where the twins had once fled to say goodbye to a brother they'd never met but somehow knew. Grace had chosen the location deliberately, wanting to transform a place of ending into a place of beginnings, a site of loss into a fountain of hope. As they prepared to leave for the hospital, Grace paused in the hallway where photographs told the story of their reconstructed family. There was the formal portrait from their wedding day, all four of them dressed in their finest clothes, but grinning like children who'd gotten away with something wonderful. There was Eleanor teaching the twins to bake cookies, flour in her hair, and joy on her face. There was Bobby learning to braid Timmy's hair, while Tommy offered helpful commentary from the sidelines. And there, in a place of honor near the front door, was Joshua's photograph. Not a formal portrait, but a candid shot Grace had taken during one of their hospital walks, when his face had been turned toward the sun and his expression had been pure contentment. The inscription below read simply, "Joshua Michael Washington, the boy who taught us that love never dies. It just finds new ways to grow." The twins appeared beside her, their school backpacks replaced by the small bouquets of sunflowers they'd insisted on bringing to the ceremony. These flowers had grown from seeds planted in the hospital garden, tended by volunteer families and hospital staff who'd embraced the memorial garden as a place of healing rather than just remembrance. "Mama Grace," Tommy said solemnly, "do you think Joshua knows about today? Do you think he knows we're trying to help other kids like him?" Grace knelt between her sons, legal papers and heart papers both confirmed, and gathered them into the embrace that had become as natural as breathing. "I think Joshua knows that love is the strongest force in the universe, and that sometimes the best way to honor someone we've lost is to love someone we've found." Timmy nodded with the wisdom of a child who'd survived loss and learned that endings could become beginnings if you were brave enough to let them. "Like how losing our first mama helped us find you, and losing Joshua helped us all find each other." Bobby appeared in the doorway, car keys in hand, and love written across his face in permanent ink. "Ready to go change the world?" Grace stood, smoothing her dress, the same navy blue one she'd worn to her interview at the Mitchell mansion, now cleaned and pressed and transformed by context from a desperate woman's armor into a symbol of how far they'd all traveled together. "Ready," she said, taking each twin's hand in hers, while Bobby gathered Eleanor from the kitchen where she was leaving detailed instructions for the housekeeper about dinner preparations. As they walked toward the car that would take them to the hospital where Joshua had died and their family had been reborn, Grace felt the weight of possibility settling around her shoulders like a shawl woven from hope and determination. Today wasn't just about honoring one little boy's memory. It was about proving that love could indeed conquer all, one family, one foundation, one healed heart at a time. The sunflowers in the twins' hands caught the Memphis sunshine, their faces turned toward the light with the eternal optimism of growing things reaching toward whatever nourishment they could find. Just like the family that carried them, blooming where they'd been planted, beautiful despite, or perhaps because of, the storms they'd weathered together. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Grace Washington never imagined that cleaning houses would lead her to become the mother of two traumatized twins, or that a wealthy white widower would see past the color of her skin to recognize the size of her heart. At 55, 68, or anywhere in between, we know that life rarely follows the script we wrote in our youth. Bobby Mitchell thought money could solve everything until he discovered that love, real, unconditional love, was the only currency that mattered to his broken sons. Eleanor Mitchell spent 6 decades believing that bloodlines determined worth, only to learn that family is built through daily acts of devotion, not DNA. This story reminds us that it's never too late to rewrite our definition of family, to choose compassion over prejudice, or to discover that our greatest purpose might be loving someone else's child as fiercely as our own. Grace found her sons when she thought her mothering days were over. The Mitchell family found their heart when they stopped looking with their eyes and started seeing with their souls. What unexpected blessing has changed your life's direction? Have you ever discovered family in the most unlikely places? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how love surprised you.